Hello, fellow Cryptopians. Node Investor here. So the pressure continues to build. There's a handful of names I'm watching here very closely. I want to go through some of those charts, some of the big names, and more specifically, an update on Bitcoin and the price action here over the last several hours. And this is a follow-up to the video I did a couple of days ago pointing out a pattern that I'm watching, and it's still very much in play, but I want to point out a couple of different scenarios and walk through some of the things I'm watching here over the next day or so. But first, quick look at the markets. The total cryptocurrency market cap continues to remain in a relatively tight range here, in and around that mid $400 million mark. Right now we're at about 461 million, and we've kind of been bouncing around, slowly going up as Bitcoin continues its climb. The altcoin market overall still drifting lower versus BTC. There hasn't been much in terms of a across the board show of strength from the alts. There's always the little pumps here and there, but for the most part, Bitcoin remains strong. The BTC dominance continues to grow. As you can see in this chart here, the overall trend for the top altcoins continues lower, following their peak in January. So right now BTC dominance is around 42%, so continues to edge its way higher. Now real quick before we get started, for those of you that are new, you can follow me and get more information at nodeinvestor.com. Follow me at Twitter at nodeinvestor, and if you go to the training tab, there is a couple of video courses I do offer. Technical analysis for those of you that want to learn a little bit more about reading the charts and the patterns that I look for, and Cryptocurrency 101, a guide to getting started with wallets, exchanges, how to buy it, how to sell it, all of that fun stuff. Check it out, nodeinvestor.com/training. Let's get to it. So first off, Bitcoin. The chart that I've been watching here, still very much in play, is this rising wedge pattern that has been forming over the last, 4 or 5 days or so, basically since end of February. And so let me just draw it out here. The pattern I'm watching is starting to get pretty narrow. The pressure is building, and it's building right under a key resistance point here, which was the prior high right around 11,800. And so you can see this chart is really starting to narrow as it gets higher and higher and closer to the apex of that pattern. Now this rising wedge pattern, it's a pretty rare pattern, and the taller and steeper the pattern, the more likely they are to play out. This one has a little bit of a slower angle to it, a little bit more 45-degree angle, so doesn't necessarily have to break, but we could still see that dip, especially since we are approaching this resistance point here around that 11.8, which was the prior major high before we saw a pretty decent pullback down to 9,300 or so. And so it would make sense that this pattern, the apex of this wedge, is starting to culminate here around this resistance. So could it go higher? Could we see a little bit of a fake out and then a breakout or a pullback? We could. And so what I'm looking at is this resistance point, as it gets closer, as it gets to the top of that wedge trend line here around 11,800, 11,900, do we see a pullback? And more specifically, I'm watching this lower trend line. Now this is kind of been going sideways here for the last couple of days, so we don't necessarily need to see that sharp pullback. We could see a little bit of a dip and then a breakout, and right now it's just pausing. And the longer this goes sideways below this resistance point, if it just continues to march sideways in this zone, then it's much more likely that this wedge does not play out, and instead we see a pretty good breakout out of this range because the pressure continues to build there. And if you look at the daily chart, the volume has been drying up a little bit as this wedge rises, which is in line with that pattern. But again, there's also that possibility, especially going into resistance, the volume, selling volume is starting to dry up. This is just taking a little bit of a pause. And then we see that little bit of a breakout. Now on the daily chart, if you look at the RSI, it's at 60. And so there is plenty of upside room on this RSI if we break out before we reach any sort of overbought conditions. So you got to keep that in mind. That's still in the cards. You don't necessarily want to play the downside or expect a dip, although I am if I have to say which side am I leaning towards a little bit more, I'm leaning a little bit more towards a small dip first, but until we see it, you got to stay in, you got to keep your stops in place, but I'm still thinking we might see a little bit of a dip. Now, the next level to look at on the upside is going to be around that high 12K mark. So if we do break out here, then 12.6 to 12.8 is going to be the next major resistance point. So that'd be a pretty decent move from here, and on a breakout that could happen relatively quickly, especially if volume comes in. So that'd be the next level I'd be watching on the upside. Now, a couple of other charts that are setting up. First off, Litecoin. Look at how narrow this range has become over these last few days as Bitcoin is sitting tight here, kind of going sideways. This chart is going very narrow, very sideways here versus the USD. Now, if you look at the BTC chart, they're still slightly underperforming, but I'd be looking at this chart as a guide, because if this breaks out to the upside, you could see a reversal on that BTC chart. It could also move in sympathy with a breakout in Bitcoin and hold par, but I'm watching how narrow this pattern is getting, and this is going to resolve itself here pretty soon. It's pretty unusual to see such tight, quiet action in the crypto markets for a sustained period of time, and generally it doesn't last one way or the other, up or down. I'm thinking we're going to see a pretty good move here in the next day or so, next day, maybe 2 days top. So I'd be watching Litecoin, keep an eye on this pattern. If this pattern breaks out, you could see a pretty rapid move to the upside, and I'm looking at a target of around 230, maybe 240 or so on that upside move on a breakout from this pattern. And that's, the 240, that's a good 15% move from this point up before we hit the next major resistance point. So keep an eye on Litecoin, another one I'm watching here. Also from the USD pair, but Bitcoin Cash. And there's a very clear overhead resistance point that this thing has been bouncing off of like a wall here. And you can see that's basically around that $1,300 mark. So if we move that up higher, you can see that's the level that has been a place where the price sells off from, but the lows are starting to get higher. You're starting to see a little bit of a pressure building up here. So I'd be watching for a breakout above that 1,300. Again, that may correspond with a breakout on the Bitcoin side. So Bitcoin Cash is another one that I'm watching as a potential upside break. Above that, there's not a ton of real big resistance. You may have some pauses along the way. This is the next major one around 1370s, and then the big one over 1400 as we approach that 1440, 1450 mark. So those are the next levels up, but I'm watching for that breakout first, and you want to see volume come in if it does go through that $1,300 mark. So that's the one I'm keeping an eye on. That one and Litecoin are the two biggies right now. There's one more, and that's Monero. I mentioned this in my last video. Monero specifically versus BTC. This is one of the stronger looking charts. If you look at the daily chart here, the bigger picture of Monero, we've had this big rally, and right now we're approaching a major resistance point. And if this breaks out from this little area here, you're going to be at all-time highs on Monero versus Bitcoin. It could very quickly move after that point. So I'm watching this here. Now this is still quite a few percent out from here, but these things move pretty quick. We're still about 10% or so before it's a clear break of that all-time high number. And on the downside, I mean, the next real big support area is 15% down from here. So it could still consolidate and bounce around this range before breaking out, but you got to keep an eye on Monero. There is a potential move coming in this. This is one I've been liking here. I've been watching it since it really started to tighten up over the last couple of weeks here, and it's starting to get some traction. So keep an eye on Monero for the upside. Again, with most of these alts though, they for the most part have been struggling to keep up when Bitcoin has had its little rallies. So you got to keep an eye on that, see how they react during a Bitcoin breakout if we see that happen. Because the question is always, if it's not outperforming Bitcoin, if the trend is lower, if it's losing ground, then you're just better off staying on the BTC side until these alts start to turn around. So that's what I'm watching for now, guys. Thanks for watching. Till next time, take care.